What we're going to be doing is giving you a very high-level, intensive overview of crisis media communications and our 12 golden rules. A bit of background in media for 20 years, teacher before that, and CIESC has been our favorite client. We've had working with CIESC, I think, for about 18 years, so it's great to be here. Clyde?
Yeah, we're glad to be here today. My background is 31 years in television news. Started anchoring and reporting back in 1970, and had a 25-year career at WRTV as an anchor and reporter. We really enjoy working with schools because we know that it's not an easy job, but you all make it look easy. And so that's one of the keys to your success. I don't want to go any further. Dave?
I worked for the Star for 15 years, and then I started law school, and then I got hired by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to be his Chief of Staff and the Supreme Court's first public information officer. And so I got to see the other side of that. And I did that for about 7 or 8 years, and then I got promoted and hired our current public information officer, Catherine Dolan, who still does a great job for the court. And now every once in a while I get to work with Clyde Lee, which is a real thrill for me. And I think you'll enjoy their work with you today and in the future.
Let's get started now with the new 12 golden rules. The rules of engagement. You have rights in an interview, and this is what they are.
You have surprisingly a surprising amount of control over the interview. There's no law that says you have to do an interview. There's no law that says you have to do it when they tell you to do it, when they want you to do it, where they want you to do it. You are not a victim. You have complete, like I said, you have a surprising amount of power. But there's no reason for you to go into an interview blindly. When someone calls up and they want to interview you, feel free to ask them all the questions you want. Ask them, what's the deadline? Who else are you talking to? Is this going to be part of a bigger package, just a one-day story or broadcast? And don't let them put you into a situation where they're filming you with a background that's unattractive to you. Because maybe your school caught on fire and they want to talk about that and they want to interview you in front of the charred remains of that school. And maybe that's not the best image you want to give. So don't let them control that setting. You have a right to move that around, do it on your time, and don't feel like you have to do the interview then. If they call, show up, you can say, I want to do the best job for you, I need some time to prepare. And if they don't want you to prepare, then you're probably not dealing with an honorable person.
Assume all comments are on the record.
Yeah, we usually say, never say, can I tell you this off the record? Because it's almost always going to get out. And so if you say something that's really entertaining, juicy, lively, they're going to try to convince you and pressure you to put it on the record. And when they take it back to their newsroom, their editors are going to pressure the reporter to get back to you to get it on the record. And so eventually they may wear you down. And it was when I worked at the Star, we could use off-the-record comments, but we had to tell the editor who it was. And we didn't know who the editor told. And so now, the thing that you told to a reporter you trusted, now two or three other people know that it was you who said this potentially controversial thing. And once it gets out beyond one person, you can't control it anymore. And so I'd be very, very careful, and I would just assume, even if they say it's off the record, don't fall into that trap. And this will happen very often at the end of an interview. The reporter will put their notebook down, they'll turn the camera off, and they'll just kind of talk to you casual, and they'll say, well, what about, we talked about this, but do you really think that's the case? You think the interview's over. And we've seen this happen when we do these mock interviews. They think the interview's over, everyone's shoulders kind of sag in relief that they've survived this interview, and now they think they're just talking. But you are still on the record. Even if they casually say, this is just between you and me.
Know your messages, know what you're going to say. Before an interview, have practiced and planned out what your strategy is and what those core messages, those talking points are. And know them. You can repeat them over and over again. It doesn't matter. It is, going back, it is your interview. And so an interview is always an opportunity to get your side of the story out to the public. So you can pivot to those talking points, and later on we'll be talking about that. But use 3 messages, make it something that you're conversational and comfortable with, you vetted it with others, and that's the key to your success. Utilize the power of preparation. So you need to think what the likely questions are, the hard, tough questions, the questions you don't want to answer, but prepare for them and know what it is you're walking into. Because it is a chess game. It is a battle of wits. And don't be lulled into thinking it's anything other than that.
And practice with one of your colleagues who's familiar with the subject matter, and even encourage them to be tough on you. And then you'll be amazed that when the reporter comes in who doesn't know a tenth of what your colleague knows, they'll ask questions that are so shallow and so incomplete, and you'll just feel so much power, because those questions of the whole interview process is going to be so much easier than what your colleague did to you.
As a print reporter, he knows this well. No penalty for brevity.
Yeah, I used to work for Chief Justice Shepard, and one of his favorite sayings, particularly when in oral argument, when lawyers would tend to go on, he'd say, "There's no penalty for brevity," encouraging them to be succinct. And I didn't work in TV, but I'm sure you all know, you've heard the phrase sound bites, and it's very important that you be concise and succinct in your sound bite. It's also true in the news media, in the print media. If you give a long, rambling answer and a reporter is recording it, he or she has to kind of boil that down. And if it's long and rambling, they're going to paraphrase it. And more people have been angered as interview subjects by a reporter's paraphrasing of their long, rambling statement than simply being flat out misquoted. And so if you keep that answer tight and short, and think of it as a soundbite too, a television soundbite. If you keep it that tight, they can't mess with it. They can't paraphrase it. They can use the whole quote. And honestly, they would rather use the whole quote rather than paraphrase what you said. So again, practice your sound bites even for print media interviews as well.
And a corollary is, if you don't want to be quoted, this is from Dave too, be dull.
Yeah, tell the truth, but be dull. Yeah. And then if you do one of these interviews and you make a little mistake, you flub up a little bit, TV reporters will let you start over again for the most part, because they don't want you stumbling around. They'll let you start over. Most print reporters will let you do it too. So don't be afraid to redo. Can I have a do-over? Now that gives them the power to choose which of the 2 quotes they'll use, so you can't really change your story, but you might come off looking better, and a little bit of practice, will help with that. Very often there'll be a situation that occurred at another school in another state, and it's a hot story nationally. And so they come to your school and they say, "What do you think about XYZ?" Even though nothing ever happened, nothing ever could happen, circumstances are completely different. Maybe it was something that happened at an all-girls school or all-boys school, and you have boys and girls in your school, so it couldn't ever happen. So they come to you and say, "Well, we need a local angle on this. What do you think about this?" It's not your story, right? And we all want to be helpful, and maybe we do want to be on TV. So we're inclined to say yes, but again, it's not your story. It's a hypothetical. There's no reason for you to feed the beast just because they have to get a local story out of something. So I would just stay away from anything that's hypothetical or speculative. What do you think would happen if this happened? How would your school react if this happened? How do you know? I mean, you can't predict the future, so why even get into that trap? And then very often, reporters will ask you a question with a kind of a loaded negative term in it. We see this one interview on 60 Minutes that we use in some presentations where the reporter says, can't you understand their anger? And the answer from the president of the company was, "I can understand their concern." So he softened it. He addressed it, said he could understand it, but he didn't repeat that negative word. And it's so easy when someone is talking to you to kind of parrot what they're saying because it's just so fresh in your mind. So be careful of those negatively charged words and don't put them into your answer.
Use touch and release, bridging techniques to pivot to the answers that you want to use. In other words, if we're in an interview and reporter asks you a question where you really don't want to go there, if you're asking me if, once again, we're kind of going to that, then there's what I'll tell you about that. So you're kind of bypassing. Now, a really good investigative reporter probably won't accept that. They're going to go back to it. But a reporter is not really as astute as maybe the number one reporter in the newsroom may go with that, and you may escape that one. You don't have to reinvent your answer. Respond to a question you've already answered by sticking to your message points. In taped interviews, you can start over. A couple of things there. And it is true. If a reporter wants to walk away with a good interview, doesn't want to have to do a tremendous amount of editing. So if you get tied up in an answer and you lose your train of thought, you can just stop and say, let me do that again. Let me start from the top. Reporters don't care. They want to come away with a good soundbite. When asked about a hot topic, reformulate the question in your answer, pivot to a related point or issue that fits with one of your messages. For instance, what I believe you're saying is, or the question I'm hearing you ask is, will work many times. Not always, but once again, the idea is really try to get as much control of the interview as you can. For broadcast interviews, they're not going to be very long to begin with. Print can talk to you via phone, whereas broadcast can't. Generally, they don't. So.
If you're asking me if, and this is a classic, because if you look back at the question, they never asked them that. They didn't ask them anything near that. But if you're asking me, and they're not, but if you're asking me this is what I think, and this is another way to kind of pivot away back to your message and to what you want to say.
It's the self-asked question.
No comment is not an answer. No comment is a great thing for a reporter. If you say I can't or there's no comment, I would save that for the end of my story. And one, I might say in my copy. And one more thing, when I asked about, here's what the response was: no comment. It sounds guilty as heck. It sounds like you're hiding something, and you'd hate to have a reporter's interview. That would be the last thing you would see or hear in the story.
You can say things like, "It's under investigation. We'll get back to you when we know more." You haven't said anything, but you've acknowledged it. When I was still at the Supreme Court, there was a budget crisis that was underway, and we didn't know if the state was going to run out of money, and the legislature was in special session, and things weren't looking good. And if there was an impasse, it was going to come to the Supreme Court to resolve it. And the question to the Supreme Court was, what are you going to do if they don't reach a deal? Number one, that's a speculative answer, a speculative question, so we didn't want to do that. But we didn't want to just say no comment and make it seem like we were insensitive to this terrible crisis that was ongoing. So Chief Justice Shepard released a statement that said, nothing can be added by adding our voice to the weight of this conversation. So he said nothing, but he showed that they were aware of the crisis and that they were prepared to deal with it. So, like I said, you can say no comment a lot of different ways than just no comment. And no comment makes people think you're hiding something.
In a print interview where a reporter may call you to get an interview with you, you want to be at a table and have your trusted advisors around you, and you also want to be on a phone where you can hit mute, and you want those people that are around you to have a Sharpie or a pen, so that an answer that's going to be a question that's going to have a potential hot answer to it, you want to be able to go to mute, and have your people say, this is the one that we're worried about. Make sure we're going to answer it this way. And usually the reporter on the other end doesn't know you're on mute, or even if you don't want to stop, you could have a number of pieces of paper ready to go with "Don't answer that one," or remember what our quote was going to be on that. So you have those things at your disposal, so use them in an interview, especially when you think it's going to be an interview that's going to be, the worst one is the interview where you think it's going to be just a run-of-the-mill interview, and it turns out that was just to get you involved, and then they move to something that you thought nobody knew about, and they start down that road. That's the one. That's kind of the another version of the ambush interview, or the story goes somewhere where you didn't expect.
If I can emphasize one thing, is to have your line of succession in place for who's going to talk. And you want to be several people deep on this. So maybe it's the superintendent, maybe it's the principal at the school, maybe it's the public information officer. But the worst thing you can do is, when the crisis happens, not to know who's going to talk, or not to know who's going to talk if the top person isn't there. I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember Rosalind's Bakery. A TV story broke over the weekend about the rat droppings in their production facility. Their PR person was in Michigan at his cabin up in northern Michigan, and this was before the days of cell phones and the internet and email. And this was a huge story because it's a great big institution in Indiana or Indianapolis. And in the 8 or 9 hours he was driving back to deal with this crisis, Rosalind's history and legacy cratered because they didn't have someone else to talk. And now all those Rosalind's bakeries are closed. I think they still sell them in grocery stores, but they didn't have a plan for a crisis or anyone to talk. So like I said, get your line of succession and make sure everyone knows who it is, and make sure everyone knows who's empowered to say what.